Welcome, weary traveler of the modern world. Tonight, we invite you to step away from the glowing screens and endless notifications that fill your days. Let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to slow, and prepare to journey back through time to a world both magnificent and brutal ancient Rome. You are safe here, in your comfortable space, wrapped in soft fabrics that our ancestors could scarcely imagine. The central heating hums quietly around you, clean water flows at the turn of a handle, and medicine waits in nearby cabinets should you need it. Hold on to this comfort, for tonight we explore a civilization where survival was never guaranteed, where entertainment meant blood, and where the line between glory and death was drawn in sand. We'll walk through the shadowed corridors beneath the Colosseum, feel the weight of wooden practice swords in calloused hands, and witness the rise of a slave who dared to challenge an empire. We lions uncover the mysteries buried beneath Rome's most famous amphitheater and glimpse the opulent world of senators who feasted while others fought for their lives. But remember, you are merely an observer tonight. Let these ancient voices wash over you like distant thunder, their struggles and triumphs becoming the gentle backdrop to your rest. Close your eyes when you feel ready. The stories will continue, carrying you softly towards sleep. Imagine yourself waking not to an alarm clock, but to the rough shake of a guard's hand on your shoulder. The air around you is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, straw bedding, and the lingering smell of yesterday's thin gruel. This is your world now, a small, cramped cell in a gladiator school, or ludus, somewhere in the sprawling city of Rome. The walls are stone, cold to the touch even in summer, and barely wide enough for you to stretch your arms. Through the iron bars of your window, if you're fortunate enough to have one, you can see the first pale light of dawn creeping across the 7 hills. But there's no time for contemplation, no moment to ease into consciousness. Your day begins now, as it has every day since you were sold, captured, or condemned to this life. You are property now, not a person in the eyes of Roman law, but a thing valuable only insofar as you can provide entertainment through your potential death. The Romans called gladiators bustiliary funeral men because the games originally served to honor the dead with blood sacrifice. How fitting that you, the living, have become the walking dead. The morning routine begins with a sparse breakfast. Barley porridge, perhaps some stale bread if the lanista, your owner and trainer, feels generous. The Romans fed their gladiators a diet heavy in carbohydrates, much like fattening livestock. This wasn't kindness. Fat provided protection for vital organs during combat, and a thick layer of flesh made wounds appear more aerodramatic to the bloodthirsty crowds without necessarily being fatal. You were being prepared for slaughter, but slowly, methodically, like a farmer fattening a pig for market. The gladiators themselves had a grim nickname for this diet. They called themselves hordery barley men. Imagine the bitter irony of that phrase on your tongue each morning as you choked down another bowl of the bland, mushy grain. Your body craved meat, craved the iron that would strengthen your blood, but meat was expensive, and you were expendable. Better to save the good cuts for the citizens who would watch you die. After this meager meal, the real work began. The training grounds of a gladiator school were designed with brutal efficiency in mind. Imagine walking into a courtyard surrounded by high walls not to keep intruders out, but to keep you in. The sand beneath your feet was already stained dark with the blood of yesterday's training, and it would drink your blood today as well. Your first task was always conditioning, running endless laps around the perimeter while guards watched from the walls above, ready with whips for anyone who faltered. Your lungs burned in the Roman heat, your legs trembled with exhaustion, but stopping meant punishment. The Romans understood that a gladiator who couldn't endure physical suffering had no value whatsoever. Then came weapons training, but not with real weapons, not yet. Instead, you were handed a wooden sword, a rudis, twice the weight of any blade you might eventually wield in the arena. Your shield, too, was wooden and deliberately cumbersome. The Romans believed that if you could fight effectively with heavy training equipment, you would be lightning fast with the real thing. They weren't wrong. but the process was agony. Hour after hour, you practiced the same basic movements. Strike, parry, step, turn. Strike, parry, step, turn. The repetition was mind-numbing, but it had to become instinct. In the arena, there would be no time to think, no moment to remember your training consciously. Your body had to know what to do, while your mind was consumed with the simple desire to survive another day. The training post, or palace, was your most frequent opponent during these long days. Picture a thick wooden pole, roughly the height of a man, planted firmly in the sand. You would attack this post with your practice weapons until your arms ached and your hands bled, until the wood was scarred and splintered from thousands of strikes. The doctors, your trainers, usually former gladiators who had won their freedom, would circle you like vultures, shouting corrections, demanding more speed, more precision, more controlled violence. Again, they would bark in Latin. Pretend it's the senator who put you here. Pretend it's the crowd that will cheer for your death. Again. But perhaps the most psychologically crushing aspect of your training was learning to fight other human beings. Not the practice post, not straw dummies, but actual people who bled and felt pain, just as you did. In the afternoon sessions, you were paired with other gladiators for spectatio practice bouts that were supposed to be non-lethal, but often weren't. The trainers would divide you by fighting style. Perhaps you were designated a retiarius, a net fighter, lightly armored and armed with a trident and weighted net. Your opponent might be a secutor, heavily armored and built to hunt down fighters like you. Or perhaps you were trained as a mamello, with a large rectangular shield and short sword, destined to face the lighter, but more agile Frex with his curved saber and small round shield. These categories weren't arbitrary. They were carefully designed to create compelling matchups for the audience, contrasts in fighting style, and equipment that would produce the most entertaining spectacle. You weren't learning to be a soldier, you were learning to be a performer. A performer whose act might well be his final one. During these training bouts, injuries were common and accepted. A broken nose, a dislocated shoulder, deep cuts from wooden weapons, these were simply the course of business. The gladiator schools had medical staff, but their job wasn't to keep you healthy. It was to keep you functional. They would stitch your wounds with the same care a chariot owner might show in repairing a wheel efficiently, effectively, but with no illusions about your ultimate expendability. The social hierarchy within the gladiator school was as rigid as anywhere in Roman society. At the bottom were the Noxy-condemned criminals who were expected to die in their first appearance and were given minimal training. Above them were the prisoners of war, who at least had military experience to build upon. At the top were the volunteers, free men who had chosen this life, usually out of desperation or the slim hope of winning enough prize money to buy a better existence. But even among volunteers, life was a constant struggle. You competed not just with your opponents in the arena, but with your fellow gladiators for the best equipment, the extra rations, the slightly less dangerous assignments. Friendships were possible, but they were always shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow you might be forced to kill the man who shared his bread with you today. The psychological pressure was relentless. Roman society constantly reminded you of your status as less than human. Citizens could kill you without legal consequence. Your children, if you had any, would likely follow you into slavery. Your name would be forgotten within a generation, remembered only as a line item in some promoter's account book. You existed solely to die entertainingly, and everyone around you knew it. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite. The gladiator barracks were overcrowded, the air stale and heavy. You slept on straw pallets that were rarely changed, surrounded by men who muttered in their dreams prayers to gods who seemed deaf, the names of families they would never see again, sometimes just wordless sounds of fear and desperation. And always, hanging over everything, was the knowledge of what awaited you in the arena. The sand that would drink your blood, the crowd that would roar for your death. The moment when all your training would be reduced to a simple question: Would you die quickly or slowly? Heroically or in terror? Remembered or forgotten? The average gladiator survived perhaps 10 fights. 10 moments when you stood on the threshold between life and death, while thousands of voices rose around you, an symphony of bloodlust. Some gladiators became famous, their names known throughout the empire, their images painted on tavern walls. But fame in the arena was like a candle in a hurricane, brilliant, brief, and ultimately snuffed out by forces beyond your control. Picture yourself now, lying on that straw pallet in your cell, listening to the distant sounds of Rome at night. Somewhere out there, senators feast on delicacies you'll never taste. Somewhere out there, free citizens sleep peacefully in soft beds, their greatest worrying perhaps the weather tomorrow or the price of grain. And here you lie, counting the days until your next fight, knowing that each one might be your last. The gladiator's life was measured not in years, but in victories. Not in love or achievement, or the simple satisfactions that make life worth living, but in the number of times you had looked death in the face and walked away. And even the greatest champions, the ones whose names echoed through the Colosseum like thunder, eventually faced an opponent they couldn't defeat, whether man, beast, or simply time itself. Tomorrow would bring more training, more pain, more preparation for an end that seemed inevitable. But tonight, in this moment, you are still alive, still breathing, still hoping, perhaps, that somehow your story might be different from all the others who had walked this path before you. Sleep now, imagining yourself in that small cell, feeling the weight of iron shackles that were never quite forgotten, even in dreams. Let the distant sounds of ancient Rome fade into the background, the night watch calling the hours, the occasional crack of a whip from the guard towers, the soft weeping of a new arrival who hasn't yet learned that tears are just another luxury gladiators cannot afford. The sand of the arena awaits, patient and thirsty. But for now, there is only rest and the small mercy of dreams that might carry you away from this world of blood and spectacle. If only until dawn breaks again over the 7 hills of Rome. The year is 73 BCE, and in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, in a gladiator school owned by Lentulus Botiatus, a man prepares for what he believes will be just another day of brutal training. His name is Spartacus, though history has wrapped so many legends around this name that the man himself has become almost mythical. Tonight, let us try to find the human being beneath the legend, a person of flesh and blood who dared to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Picture him in those early morning hours, before the rebellion that would shake Rome to its very foundations. Spartacus was likely in his 30s, his body bearing the scars of countless battles fought in service to Rome as an auxiliary soldier, and later, the marks of gladiatorial training. He was Thracian from the mountainous region north of Greece, where tribes had fought against Roman expansion for generations. His people were known as fierce warriors, comfortable with violence, but also deeply connected to the land and to their freedom. But how does a warrior become a slave? How does a man who once fought for his own people find himself fighting for the entertainment of his enemies? The sources whisper different possibilities. Perhaps Spartacus was captured in one of Rome's many campaigns in Thrace. Perhaps he was a deserter from the Roman army, a crime punishable by death or enslavement. Or perhaps, as some ancient writers suggested, he had been a brigand, preying on Roman travelers until he was finally caught and condemned to the arena. The truth, lost to time, matters less than this. Spartacus understood both freedom and its absence in ways that few men ever have. He had tasted the mountain air of Thrace, had known what it meant to make his own choices, to live by his own code. And now he found himself in Capua, property of another man, forced to kill for the amusement of crowds who saw him as less than human. Imagine the gladiator school at Capua in those days. It was one of the most prestigious in the Roman world, housing perhaps 200 fighters at any given time. The barracks were better than most. Botiatus could afford to feed his property well, to provide decent medical care, even small luxuries for his most successful fighters. But comfort, no matter how relative, could never erase the fundamental reality. These men were slaves, and they would remain slaves until death claimed them in the sand. Spartacus was not just any gladiator. The ancient historians tell us he was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed of a natural authority that drew other men to him. In the brutal hierarchy of the gladiator school, he had risen to a position of respect. Other fighters listened when he spoke. They sought his counsel, looked to him for leadership in the small rebellions that made slave life bearable: the shared extra ration, the hidden coin, the whispered plan to make a guard's life miserable. But Spartacus was dreaming of something larger than small acts of defiance. In the evenings, when the training was done and the gladiators were locked in their quarters, he would speak quietly with a select few. There was Crixus, a Gaul whose hatred of Rome burned like a forge fire. There was Enigmas, another Gaul, quick with both sword and wit. There was Gannicus, whose reputation in the arena was matched only by his reputation for a defying authority. These men had all tasted defeat at Roman hands. They had all been broken down and rebuilt as instruments of entertainment. But in their quiet conversations, something new was taking shape: not just the dream of escape, but the vision of something that had never been attempted before, a slave rebellion that might actually succeed. The plan, when it finally crystallized, was breathtakingly simple. The gladiators were scheduled to fight in games, celebrating some minor Roman holiday, the kind of spectacle that happened dozens of times each year throughout the empire. But instead of filing docilely into the arena to kill each other for Roman amusement, they would turn their weapons on their captors. On a spring day in 73 BCE, as the sun climbed over Campania, Spartacus and 73 of his fellow gladiators made their move. The exact details have been lost to time, but we can imagine the controlled chaos as the plan unfolded. Perhaps they overwhelmed the guards during the morning meal. Perhaps they seized weapons from the training armory. Perhaps they simply refused to fight and turned instead on the shocked Roman audience. What we know for certain is this: somehow, impossibly, they succeeded. 74 men, armed with whatever weapons they could seize, fought their way out of Capua and into the Italian countryside. Behind them lay everything they had known for years: the brutal routine of training, the constant threat of death, the small comforts that had made their slavery bearable. Ahead lay uncertainty, pursuit by the most powerful military machine in the ancient world, and almost certain death, but they were free. Picture them in those first hours after the escape, perhaps hiding in the forests that covered much of southern Italy in those days. The adrenaline of combat was fading, replaced by the stark reality of what they had done. They were escaped slaves in a society where such rebellion was punishable by crucifixion, not just for the rebels themselves, but often for any slave who had the misfortune to be nearby when the example needed to be made. Yet something remarkable happened in those early days. Word of the escape spread through the slave communities of Campania like wildfire, and other desperate souls began to seek them out. Field slaves from the great estates, household servants, gladiators from other schools, men and women who had nothing left to lose began to swell Spartacus's ranks. Within weeks, his band of 74 had grown to several hundred. Within months, it would number in the tens of thousands. The Roman response was initially dismissive. Slave rebellions, while always dangerous, were typically small affairs that could be crushed by local magistrates with a few cohorts of troops. The Senate dispatched Gaius Claudius Glaber with a force of 3,000 men, even a full legion, to deal with what they saw as a minor inconvenience. Glaber's strategy was sound by conventional military thinking. He cornered Spartacus's growing army on Mount Vesuvius, blocking the only apparent path down from the mountain. From the Roman perspective, it was simply a matter of waiting. The slaves had no supply lines, no allies, nowhere to go. Hunger and thirst would do what Roman swords might accomplish more messily, but Spartacus had not survived years as a warrior and gladiator by accepting apparent defeat. As Glaber's troops settled in for what they expected to be a brief siege, the slave army was working through the night on an audacious plan. Using vines and branches, they created makeshift ropes and lowered themselves down the steep cliffs on the far side of the mountain, the side that Glaber had deemed impossible to traverse. Imagine the Roman general's shock when, instead of starving rebels begging for mercy, he found himself attacked from behind by a force that had supposedly been trapped. Glaber's troops, caught completely off guard, broke and fled. Spartacus had won his first victory against Rome itself, and the psychological impact was enormous. Here was proof that Roman military might was not invincible, that clever planning and desperate courage could triumph over superior numbers and equipment. More importantly for the rebellion's future, Spartacus now had weapons, armor, and supplies seized from Glaber's abandoned camp. His followers could equip themselves as proper soldiers rather than desperate fugitives. The transformation from escaped slaves to revolutionary army was beginning, but with success came new challenges. The rebel force was growing rapidly, drawing not just slaves, but free poor, bandits, and others who had grievances against Roman rule. Managing such a diverse group required skills that went far beyond gladiatorial combat. Spartacus found himself not just a military commander, but a political leader, trying to hold together an alliance of people who had little in common except their hatred of Rome. The ancient sources suggest that tensions emerged early between Spartacus and some of his fellow gladiator leaders. Crixus, in particular, seemed to favor a campaign of revenge against their former masters, burning villas, killing Roman citizens, extracting payment for years of humiliation and abuse. Spartacus, however, appeared to have a grander vision. Some historians suggest he dreamed of leading his followers back to their homelands, beyond the reach of Roman power. Others propose that he hoped to spark similar rebellions throughout the empire, bringing down the entire system of slavery through coordinated uprising. The truth, as always with Spartacus, remains elusive. What we can say with certainty is that through 73 and into 70 BCE, his army continued to grow and to win victories that sent shockwaves through Roman society. Praetor Publius Varinius arrived with larger forces, only to suffer defeats that were even more humiliating than Glaber's. The slaves were not just winning battles, they were outgeneraling experienced Roman commanders. Picture the scene in the Roman Senate as reports arrived of each new defeat. These were not barbarian invasions from beyond the frontier threats that Rome had always faced and usually overcome. This was rebellion from within, led by men who had intimate knowledge of Roman tactics and Roman weaknesses. The very people Rome had enslaved were turning that knowledge against their masters. The psychological impact on Roman society cannot be overstated. The entire economic system of the Republic depended on slave labor. Vast estates worked by chained gangs, households served by human property, gladiatorial schools that fed the population's appetite for violent entertainment. All of it relied on the assumption that slaves would remain docile, accepting their fate with sullen resignation. Spartacus had shattered that assumption. In slave quarters throughout Italy, whispered conversations took on a new urgency. Was freedom actually possible? Could the seemingly invincible Roman system be challenged? Should they risk everything to join this impossible rebellion? Or was it better to keep their heads down and hope that the inevitable Roman victory would not bring too terrible a retribution? Meanwhile, Spartacus's army continued its remarkable string of successes. They moved through southern Italy like a force of nature, their numbers swelling with each victory. By some accounts, at the rebellion's height, Spartacus commanded over 100,000 followers. Even allowing for exaggeration in the ancient sources, this represents one of the largest slave uprisings in human history. But success brought its own problems. Feeding and moving such a large force required constant foraging and raiding. The rebels were forced to live off the land, and while many Roman estates were happy to contribute supplies under threat of force, This strategy could not continue indefinitely. Moreover, the diverse motivations of his followers' revenge, freedom, simple survival were becoming harder to reconcile as the rebellion dragged on. The ancient historians paint a picture of increasing friction within the rebel leadership. Crixus apparently grew frustrated with what he saw as Spartacus's overly cautious strategy. Why not march on Rome itself? Why not make the masters pay in blood for generations of oppression? The split became irreparable when Crixus led a significant portion of the army off for his own campaign, seeking the immediate gratification of revenge over the longer-term goal of freedom. This division proved catastrophic. Roman forces under Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most ambitious men in Rome, caught Crixus's army in isolation and destroyed it. Crixus himself died in the battle, along with thousands of his followers. The rebellion had lost not just numbers, but one of its most charismatic leaders. For Spartacus, the loss must have been both personal and strategic devastation. Crixus had been with him from the beginning, a fellow gladiator who had shared the dream of freedom. Now his old comrade was dead, and the rebel army was significantly weakened, just as Rome was finally taking the threat seriously. Crassus was not another minor magistrate sent to deal with a local disturbance. He was one of Rome's most capable generals, and he had been given resources proportional to the threat: 8 legions, nearly 50,000 professional soldiers, the best equipment and supplies Rome could provide. More importantly, he had the full authority of the Senate behind him and the promise of enormous rewards for success. The final phase of the rebellion played out across southern Italy through 71 BCE, a deadly game of cat and mouse between Spartacus's remaining forces and Crassus's legions. The slave army was still formidable, but it was no longer the confident, growing force that had terrorized Roman commanders in the early stages of the rebellion. Now it was an army in retreat, looking desperately for a way to escape Italy entirely. Spartacus's plan, according to the ancient sources, was to secure passage across the Strait of Messina to Sicily. The island had a history of slave rebellions, and its terrain might provide better opportunities for guerrilla warfare. But the plan required cooperation from Cilician pirates who had promised ships in exchange for payment. When the pirates took the money and sailed away without providing transportation, Spartacus found himself trapped in southern Italy with Crassus closing in from the north. The end, when it came, had the tragic inevitability of Greek drama. Pinned against the sea by Crassus's forces, with no hope of escape and no possibility of victory, Spartacus made the choice that defined him. He would die as a free man, sword in hand, rather than return to slavery. The final battle took place in 71 BCE, somewhere in the mountains of southern Italy. The exact location is lost to history, but we can imagine the scene. Exhausted rebels making their last stand against the disciplined ranks of Roman legionaries, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but crucifixion for the survivors. Spartacus himself died in that battle, though his body was never found among the thousands of corpses that littered the battlefield. Some ancient writers claimed he died like a gladiator, cutting his way through enemy ranks until sheer numbers overwhelmed him. Others suggested he tried to reach Crassus himself, seeking to end the war with single combat. We will never know the truth, but perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that he died free, having chosen his own fate, rather than accepting the destiny Rome had planned for him. The aftermath was as brutal as the rebellion had been inspiring. Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. 4 miles, travelers would pass the rotting bodies of men who had dared to dream of freedom. It was a message written in flesh and agony. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome. But messages, like rebellions, can have unintended consequences. The crucified slaves became martyrs, symbols of resistance that inspired others long after their bodies had been reduced to bones. The name Spartacus survived when the names of his crucifiers were forgotten by all but historians. The dream he represented that the powerless might challenge the powerful, that freedom was worth any sacrifice proved more durable than the crosses that displayed Rome's victory. Sleep now, and picture that Thracian warrior in his cell in Capua. In those quiet moments before the rebellion began, he could not have known that his name would echo through the centuries, that his story would inspire other rebels and dreamers in ages yet to come. He knew only that he was a man, not property, that he had been born free and would die free, regardless of what Roman law might say about his status. In that small act of self-definition, I am a man, not a thing, Spartacus achieved a victory that outlasted any battlefield triumph. The empire that crucified his followers eventually crumbled into dust. The institution of slavery that seemed so permanent eventually withered away. But the idea that human dignity cannot be destroyed by chains or laws, or the threat of death, that idea survived, carried forward by every generation that heard his story and recognized something of themselves in his struggle. The rebellion failed, as perhaps it had too. But the rebel succeeded in ways that his enemies could never have imagined, winning immortality not through conquest, but through the simple courage to say no to injustice, even when saying no meant certain death. Picture yourself standing in the center of the Colosseum's arena floor on a quiet Roman afternoon, perhaps in the year 85 CE, just a few years after the great amphitheater's completion. The seats above you stretch upward in seemingly endless tiers, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, but today they are empty. The only sounds are your own footsteps on the sand and the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls. What you see around you, this oval expanse of sand, these towering walls, represents only half the story of Rome's greatest architectural marvel. Beneath your feet lies another world entirely, a vast underground complex that ancient Romans called the Hypogeum, literally, the underground place. This subterranean realm was the true heart of the gladiatorial games, a maze of corridors, chambers, and mechanical marvels that made the spectacles above possible. But here is where our story becomes mysterious, for much of what we know about the Hypogeum comes not from ancient writings, but from archaeological detective work conducted centuries after the last gladiator fought and died on the sand above. The Romans, for all their meticulous record-keeping, were surprisingly secretive about the technical details of their greatest entertainment venue. Perhaps they understood that revealing too much about the mechanics of spectacle would diminish its magic. Or perhaps they simply took their engineering genius for granted, never imagining that future generations would struggle to understand how they accomplished what they did. Let us descend now into that hidden world, following the path that thousands of gladiators, wild animals, and stage hands took in the centuries when the Colosseum was Rome's beating heart. Imagine a narrow stone staircase, worn smooth by countless feet, leading down from the arena floor into increasing darkness. The air grows cooler as you descend, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable scent of mortality and fresh blood, but the deeper, more persistent odor that comes from centuries of death and suffering absorbed into stone and sand. The Hypogeum extended to full stories beneath the arena floor, a complex that would have impressed even modern architects with its sophisticated design and engineering. The upper level, just below the sand, was a maze of corridors arranged in concentric ovals that followed the shape of the arena above. These passages were wide enough for large animals, elephants, rhinoceros, even the occasional giraffe brought from the far reaches of the empire, but narrow enough that such beasts could be controlled and directed by handlers who knew the secret pathways. Picture yourself walking through these corridors in the hours before a major spectacle. The air would have been thick with tension and the sounds of preparation. Gladiators in their holding cells, some praying to gods, both Roman and foreign, others sharpening weapons or tending to old wounds. The roar of wild animals echoing from the beast chambers, where lions paced in cages barely large enough to contain them, where bears from Germania shuffled restlessly, where exotic creatures from Africa and Asia waited to play their parts in Rome's grand theatre of death. But the most remarkable features of the hypogeum were not the holding cells or even the intricate network of passages. The true marvels were the mechanical devices that made possible the spectacles that awed Roman audiences and continue to mystify historians today. Chief among these were the lift systems, a series of counterweighted elevators that could raise men, animals, and elaborate stage scenery from the underground chambers to the arena floor above. These lifts, called hegmata by the Romans, were scattered throughout the arena floor, precisely calculated intervals. Modern archaeologists have identified the locations of 28 major lift shafts, though there were likely dozens of smaller ones as well. Each was connected to chambers below by a system of pulleys, counterweights, and human-powered capstans that could raise loads of several hundred pounds from the depths to the arena floor a matter of seconds. Imagine the effect on an audience that had no understanding of the machinery beneath their feet. A gladiatorial combat would be proceeding normally when suddenly, without warning, the sand would part and a trapdoor would open. Up would rise a fresh fighter, or a wild animal, or an entire stage set, a forest scene complete with trees and rocks, a naval battle set up with pools of water, even architectural elements that could transform the arena into a facsimile of a famous city or battlefield. The Roman audiences never saw the army of workers who made these miraculous appearances possible. Hidden in the hypogeum, teams of slaves and technicians operated the complex machinery with choreographed precision. The timing had to be perfect. A trapdoor opening a second too early or too late could ruin the dramatic effect of a spectacle that might have taken months to plan and enormous sums to finance. But how exactly did these lift systems work? Here we encounter one of the great mysteries of Roman engineering. While we can see the remains of the lift shafts and counterweight chambers, the actual mechanisms have long since vanished. What survives are stone tracks where wooden guides once ran, pivot points where bronze fittings once rotated, and chambers where counterweights once hung. From these fragments, archaeologists and engineers have attempted to reconstruct the technology, but much remains uncertain. The most widely accepted theory suggests that the lifts operated on a counterweight principle similar to modern elevators. Heavy stone weights, suspended in vertical shafts, would be connected by rope and pulley systems to the platform lifts. Teams of workers would manipulate the counterweights, raising and lowering the arena platforms with relative ease. But this explanation, while mechanically sound, fails to account for the sheer complexity of the operations that ancient sources describe. Consider, for instance, the now mock naval battles that occasionally took place in the Colosseum. These spectacles required not just lifting mechanisms, but a way to flood portions of the arena floor with water, creating temporary lakes where miniature warships could maneuver and fight. The engineering challenges involved in waterproofing sections of the arena, controlling water flow, and then draining the space quickly enough to return to normal gladiatorial combats were enormous. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Romans solved these problems with typical ingenuity. A series of channels and drains, carved into the bedrock beneath the hypogeum, could direct water flow throughout the underground complex. Some chambers appear to have been designed as reservoirs, capable of storing large quantities of water that could be released when needed. Others show signs of having housed pumping mechanisms, likely worked by teams of slaves, that could quickly drain flooded areas. But the water systems of the hypogeum served purposes beyond spectacular naval battles. The underground complex required constant cleaning, and the easiest way to wash away the blood, sand, and debris that accumulated after each day's games was to flood the lower chambers and let the current carry the waste through carefully designed drainage channels that led ultimately to the sewers of Rome. More mysterious still are the accounts of elaborate stage machinery that could create effects that seem almost supernatural to modern readers. Ancient sources describe trees that rose from the arena floor already heavy with fruit, architectural elements that appeared and disappeared as if by magic, even mechanisms that could make it appear to rain blood or gold coins on the audience. While some of these accounts are likely exaggerated, the basic technology to create such effects clearly existed. The key was concealment and timing. Trapdoors in the arena floor could be disguised with thin layers of sand, virtually invisible to spectators, but easily broken through by rising platforms. Scenery could be pre-positioned on lift platforms, ready to ascend at the proper moment. Even the famous spa shows the scattering of perfume, flower petals, or occasionally coins to the audience were likely delivered through hidden mechanisms rather than thrown by hand. The workforce required to operate the hypogeum in major games was enormous. Conservative estimates suggest that several hundred people worked below ground during a typical day of spectacles. These included not only the technical crews who operated the lifts and maintained the machinery, but also animal handlers, gladiator attendants, medical personnel, and the various specialists needed to coordinate the complex timing of arena events. Most of these workers were slaves, of course, and their working conditions in the hypogeum were brutal even by Roman standards. The underground chambers were hot, humid, and filled with noxious fumes from both animal waste and the burning oil that provided illumination. The risk of injury from the heavy machinery was constant, and a worker who was crushed by a lift or mauled by an escaped animal could expect little in the way of medical care. Yet there was also a hierarchy among the hypogeum workers that reflected the complexity of their tasks. At the bottom were the simple laborers who hauled water, cleaned cages, and provided muscle power for the machinery. Above them were the skilled technicians who understood the lift mechanisms and could perform basic maintenance. At the top were the engineers and coordinators who planned the complex sequences of arena events and ensured that each element appeared at precisely the right moment. Some of these master technicians achieved a measure of fame in their own right. Ancient graffiti found in the ruins of the hypogeum includes names that appear repeatedly, suggesting that certain individuals were recognized for their expertise in creating memorable spectacles. These men, and they were almost certainly all men, possessed knowledge that was both highly valuable and closely guarded. The techniques for operating the arena machinery were trade secrets, passed down through informal apprenticeships rather than written manuals. This secrecy has proven frustrating for modern researchers trying to understand how the hypogeum actually functioned. While Roman writers were happy to describe the spectacular effects created by the underground machinery, they showed little interest in explaining how those effects were achieved. It was as if a modern journalist wrote about a magic show, while carefully avoiding any mention of the magician's methods. The result is that much of what we think we know about the hypogeum is educated guesswork based on fragmentary archaeological evidence. For instance, we can see the remains of what appears to have been an elaborate pulley system in one section of the underground complex, but the wooden components that would show us exactly how it operated have long since rotted away. We know that animals were somehow transported from holding cages to arena floor level, but the exact mechanisms remain unclear. Recent archaeological work has revealed new mysteries rather than solving old ones. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques have shown that the hypogeum was even more complex than previously thought, with chambers and passages that have not yet been excavated. Some of these spaces appear to have been sealed deliberately, perhaps containing equipment or materials that the Romans considered too dangerous or too valuable to leave accessible. One tantalizing discovery is a series of chambers that seem to have been designed for acoustic effects. The shape and size of these rooms suggest that they might have been used to amplify sounds, the roar of animals, perhaps, or the clash of weapons, creating audio effects that enhanced the spectacle above. If this theory is correct, it would represent yet another level of sophistication in Roman entertainment technology. The hypogeum also contained spaces that were clearly residential, not comfortable living quarters, but basic accommodations for people who needed to remain underground for extended periods. These might have housed the animal trainers who worked most closely with dangerous beasts, or perhaps the technical specialists whose presence was required throughout the games. Living in the hypogeum would have been like dwelling in a very specialized version of hell, surrounded by the constant threat of violence from above and below, breathing air thick with the smell of death, never quite knowing whether the next sound you heard would be the roar of the crowd or the last cry of another victim. As you walk through these ancient chambers today, guided by the careful reconstructions of archaeologists and engineers, try to imagine them as they were in their prime. Picture the organized chaos of a major game day, with hundreds of workers moving through torch-lit corridors, checking equipment, feeding animals, preparing gladiators for what might be their final appearance. Listen for the echoes of ancient voices, Latin commands barked by supervisors, the prayers of condemned men, the growls and roars of beasts that knew, somehow, that they were being prepared for slaughter, but also marvel at the ingenuity that created this underground world. The Romans built the hypogeum without the benefit of electric power, steel construction, or modern materials, yet they created a system capable of producing theatrical effects that continued to amaze audiences for centuries. The knowledge and skill required to design, build, and operate such a complex was enormous, representing one of the highest achievements of ancient engineering. When the gladiatorial games finally ended, sometime in the early 6th century CE, the hypogeum was abandoned to darkness and decay. The wooden machinery rotted away, the drainage systems filled with debris, and the chambers that had once echoed with human voices fell silent. For more than 1,000 years, this underground marvel was forgotten, buried beneath accumulated soil and rubble until archaeologists began excavating in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, as you prepare to ascend from these depths back to the modern world, consider the irony that surrounds the hypogeum. The Romans created this masterpiece of engineering to facilitate spectacles of death and suffering. Yet what survives, what continues to inspire wonder and admiration, is not the violence that took place above ground, but the human creativity and technical skill that made that violence possible. The gladiators are long dead, their individual stories lost to time, but the chambers where they waited, the machinery that lifted them to their fate, the evidence of human ingenuity applied to the most brutal of purposes, these endure as testament to both the brilliance and the darkness of ancient Rome. Sleep now, and let your mind wander through those torch-lit corridors beneath the sand. Imagine yourself as one of the few who knew the secrets of the hypogeum, who understood how the impossible was made to seem routine, who possessed the keys to Rome's greatest theatre of illusion. In your dreams, perhaps, you can hear the echo of ancient voices, the creak of wooden machinery, and the distant roar of crowds that have been silent for 1,500 years. Dawn breaks over the Palatine Hill, and golden light filters through the delicate curtains of silk that drape the windows of one of Rome's most magnificent homes. This is not the harsh awakening that greets a gladiator in his cell, but rather the gentle stirring of a man whose power extends across continents, whose word can determine the fate of nations. You are Marcus Aurelius Corvus, a name we have invented, but one that would have been perfectly at home among the marble halls of the Roman Senate. Today, as every day, your survival depends not on sword and shield, but on wit, wealth, and the delicate navigation of political currents that could destroy you as surely as any arena beast. Your bedroom is a study in refined luxury that would have been incomprehensible to most of the empire's inhabitants. The walls are covered with frescoes depicting scenes from Greek mythology, painted by artists whose families have served yours 4 generations. The floor is a masterpiece of mosaic work, tiny pieces of colored stone arranged in patterns that seem to shift and dance in the morning light. Your bed is not a simple pallet, but a piece of furniture that represents more wealth than most Romans would see in a lifetime, carved from precious woods imported from India, inlaid with ivory and silver, draped with linen so fine they feel like water against the skin. But even as you enjoy these luxuries, you are acutely aware of their fragility. You are wealthy beyond measure, yes, But in the Roman system, wealth without political protection is merely treasure waiting to be confiscated. Your comfortable awakening is attended by the knowledge that today, like every day, you must navigate the treacherous currents of imperial favor and senatorial rivalry. One wrong word, one misplaced alliance, and all of this, the villa, the slaves, the carefully accumulated power, could vanish like morning mist. Your personal slave, Gaius, a Greek educated in philosophy and rhetoric, worth more than many senators' entire estates, approaches with the quiet deference that marks the well-trained servant. He does not speak unless spoken to, but his presence is comforting in its familiarity. Gaius has been with your family since before you were born. He knows your habits, your preferences, your moods better than your own wife does. In the complex hierarchy of Roman slavery, he occupies an almost paradoxical position, powerless under law, yet wielding considerable influence over the daily decisions of one of the empire's most powerful men. The morning reports, Dominus, he says softly, using the formal address that acknowledges your status as master of the household. The reports he carries represent an intelligence network that rivals anything the emperor himself might possess. Your agents throughout the city, slaves, freedmen, clients, and allies, have spent the night gathering information that could prove vital to your survival. Who dined with whom last evening? What rumors are circulating in the markets? Which of your fellow senators might be planning moves against your interests? As Gaius reads these reports in his cultured voice, you submit to the ministrations of your personal attendants. Unlike the quick, functional bathing of a gladiator, your morning ablutions are an elaborate ritual that could easily consume 2 hours. First comes the massage with imported oils that smell of distant spices, performed by slaves trained from childhood in the subtle art of easing the tensions from aristocratic muscles. Then the careful arrangement of your hair by specialists who understand that even the way you wear your locks can send political messages to those who know how to read them. Your clothing, too, is a form of communication as precise as any speech you might deliver in the Senate. The toga you will wear today, assuming you plan to appear in public in your official capacity, is not merely a garment, but a statement of identity and status. Only Roman citizens may wear the toga, and only senators may wear one with the broad purple stripe that marks your rank. The way it drapes, the quality of the wool, even the precise shade of the purple dye, all combine to announce your position in the social hierarchy before you speak a single word. But first, breakfast, and even this simple meal reflects the vast gulf between your existence and that of ordinary Romans. While the gladiators choke down their barley porridge, your table groans under the weight of delicacies gathered from across the known world. Fresh bread, baked before dawn in ovens tended by specialist slaves. Honey from Mount Hybla in Sicily, prized for its delicate flavor. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans considered the height of culinary sophistication, imported at enormous expense from the best producers in Spain. Wine from the choicest vineyards, some bottles older than the slaves who serve them. As you eat, you review the day's political agenda with your secretary, another educated slave whose value lies not in his physical strength, but in his ability to navigate the complex web of Roman administrative procedure. There are letters to be answered from clients throughout the empire, men whose fortunes depend on your favor, who send tribute and information in return for your protection and influence. There are legal cases to consider, for your wealth and status make you a natural patron for those seeking justice in the Roman courts. There are business matters to review, for your fortune does not maintain itself. It requires constant attention to the ships, farms, workshops, and money-lending operations that generate your enormous income. But underneath all of these mundane concerns runs the deeper current of political survival. The Roman Senate, in this era of imperial rule, is a body caught between its ancient dignity and its modern powerlessness. Senators still possess enormous wealth and social prestige, but real power belongs to the emperor and his supporters. Your challenge, like that of every senator who hopes to keep his head on his shoulders, is to appear important enough to be worth courting, but not so important as to seem threatening. The morning's most crucial intelligence concerns the emperor's mood and intentions. Through your network of palace servants, freedmen, and minor officials, you learn that last night's imperial dinner party went smoothly, always a good sign for the general political atmosphere. The emperor seemed pleased with the entertainment, laughed at the appropriate jokes, showed favor to the right courtiers. More importantly, there were no arrests, no sudden disappearances, no signs of the paranoid rage that could transform Rome's ruler from benevolent father figure to murderous tyrant in the space of an evening. Still, there are troubling undercurrents. Your sources report that certain senators have been meeting privately, ostensibly to discuss matters of trade policy, but possibly for more dangerous purposes. In the empire's current political climate, even the appearance of conspiracy can be fatal. You must decide whether to distance yourself from these men, potentially losing valuable allies, or to maintain your connections and risk guilt by association. As the morning progresses, you receive a stream of visitors in the atrium of your home, the formal reception area, where Roman aristocrats traditionally conducted business. These are your clients, men of lesser status who depend on your patronage for their survival and advancement. They come bearing the morning salutation, a ritual of respect that acknowledges your superior position while providing you with opportunities to display your wealth and generosity. Some of your clients are former slaves whom you have freed, men who now owe their liberty to your decision, and who can never entirely escape that obligation. Others are free-born citizens of modest means who have attached themselves to your household as the only way to achieve security in a precarious world. Still others are fellow aristocrats whose fortunes have declined, forcing them to seek the protection of more successful rivals. Each client receives attention calibrated to his importance and usefulness. To the freedman who manages your estates in Gaul, you show warm familiarity, asking after his family and his health. To the struggling senator whose vote you may need in future legislative battles, you display respectful courtesy. To the aspiring poet who amuses you with his verses, you offer casual friendship. But underneath these varied relationships lies the fundamental reality of Roman social structure. Everything is transactional, every gesture calculated for its political impact. The morning clientele complete, you face the day's central decision, whether to attend the Senate meeting scheduled for this afternoon. In the old days of the Republic, such a question would have been unthinkable. A senator's duty was to participate in the governance of Rome. An absence without cause was both shameful and dangerous. But under imperial rule, the Senate's role has been fundamentally altered. Important decisions are made in the Emperor's Council, not in the ancient chamber, where Cicero once thundered against his enemies. Yet attendance remains important, if only as a display of loyalty and engagement. More crucially, the Senate House is where much of Rome's most important political business is actually conducted, not in the formal sessions, but in the whispered conversations between votes, the careful negotiations inside chambers, the delicate arrangements that determine how the empire's vast wealth will be distributed among its ruling class. Your decision to attend is influenced by intelligence that several items of personal interest will be discussed today. There is a debate scheduled over tax farming contracts in Asia Minor, where you have significant investments. There will be votes on the allocation of funds for public works projects, some of which could benefit properties you own in Rome itself. Most importantly, there are rumors that the emperor may use today's session to announce changes in provincial governorships positions that offer enormous opportunities for enrichment to those wise enough to position themselves favorably. The journey to the Senate House requires its own careful choreography. You cannot simply walk through the streets like an ordinary citizen. Your status demands a proper retinue. Your litter, carried by 8 carefully matched slaves, announces your rank to anyone you encounter. The litter itself is a work of art, carved wood, inlaid with precious metals, curtains of the finest fabric, cushions stuffed with down from birds that nest only in the remotest corners of the empire. but it also represents security. The bearers are chosen as much for their loyalty and strength as for their matching appearance, and several of your personal guards follow on foot, armed and alert for any sign of trouble. The Rome through which you travel is a city of stark contrasts that would overwhelm the senses of any modern visitor. The streets are narrow and crowded, filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of a million people crammed into a space never designed to hold so many. Merchants hawk their wares in voices that must carry over the general din. Craftsmen work at their trades in shop fronts that open directly onto the street. Animals, horses, mules, dogs, even the occasional exotic creature from the provinces add their own contributions to the urban symphony, but from within your litter, cushioned and curtained, you are insulated from most of these sensory assaults. What reaches you is a more refined version of urban life, the respectful greetings of citizens who recognize your litter and hope to gain favor by acknowledging your presence, the careful navigation of your bearers through streets that part before wealth and rank, the quiet efficiency of slaves and freedmen who understand that their survival depends on making your journey as smooth and pleasant as possible. The Senate House itself, when you arrive, is both a monument to Rome's ancient traditions and a reminder of how much has changed. The building is magnificent marble columns that soar toward a coffered ceiling, walls decorated with frescoes celebrating the city's glorious history, floors paved with stones quarried in the far corners of the empire. But the men who gather here, for all their dignity and formal togas, know that they are playing roles in a drama whose real authors write their scripts elsewhere. The afternoon session unfolds with the stately ritual that has governed Roman political life for centuries. The consul calls the meeting to order. Prayers are offered to the gods who supposedly guide the empire's destiny. The day's agenda is announced with the formal language that transforms mundane administrative decisions into matters of state importance. But underneath the ceremony, the real business of the session proceeds through glances, nods, and whispered conversations that require no formal votes to be effective. You vote with the majority on most issues, as prudence dictates. But on the tax farming question, you make a carefully calculated intervention. Rising to speak, you offer observations that seem to focus on the technical details of provincial administration, but actually serve to protect your own interests while appearing to champion the public good. Your speech is brief, lengthy oratory is no longer fashionable in an age when real decisions are made by one man, but precisely targeted to influence the votes that matter. The applause that greets your remarks is polite rather than enthusiastic, but that suits your purposes perfectly. You have demonstrated your expertise and your engagement without appearing to challenge anyone's authority or advance any dangerous agenda. Several fellow senators nod approvingly, and you note which ones seem most impressed by your arguments. These small observations could prove valuable in future negotiations. As the session continues, you find yourself studying your colleagues with the same attention a gladiator might devote to examining his opponent's fighting style. That elderly senator in the front row, whose family claims descent from the kings of Rome, is he still influential enough to be worth courting, or has age made him a liability? The younger man to rows behind you, whose father was executed for treason, but who has somehow managed to rehabilitate the family name, is he a potential ally or a dangerous reminder of how quickly fortunes can change? The most interesting figure in the chamber is not officially a member of the Senate at all. In a seat reserved for honored guests sits one of the emperor's freedmen, a former slave who now wields more real power than most of the aristocrats around him. His presence is a reminder that in imperial Rome, proximity to the ruler matters more than ancient bloodlines or traditional honors. This man, who legally could not even be a citizen until his master chose to free him, now sits in judgment on the proposals of senators whose families have served Rome for centuries. When the formal session ends, the real work begins. Groups form and reform in the chambers adjacent to the main hall, as senators pursue the private conversations that actually determine how Rome will be governed. You move carefully among these gatherings, offering support here, expressing reservations there, always calibrating your positions to maintain the maximum number of options while minimizing your exposure to dangerous associations. One conversation proves particularly valuable. A fellow senator, whose estates in Egypt make him an expert on grain supply issues, shares intelligence about potential shortages that could affect food prices in Rome itself. This information, properly used, could guide investment decisions worth millions of sestertii. More importantly, it provides you with knowledge you can share selectively with other senators, building relationships that may prove crucial when you need political support for your own initiatives. Another exchange is more troubling. A colleague whose judgment you trust takes you aside to share concerns about the emperor's health. Nothing definite, he emphasizes, just rumors from palace physicians, whispers among the imperial slaves, the kind of speculation that always swirls around aging rulers. But if the emperor is indeed failing, the implications for every senator are enormous. The succession question, never far from any Roman politician's mind, could soon move from theoretical concern to immediate crisis. As the afternoon shadows lengthen, you make your way home through streets that have grown even more crowded and chaotic. The working day is ending for most Romans, but your day is far from over. The evening hours will bring their own challenges and opportunities as you navigate the complex social obligations that bind the Roman aristocracy together. Tonight, you will attend a dinner party hosted by another senator, an event that is simultaneously social gathering, business meeting, and political negotiation. The guest list has been carefully assembled to include men whose support could prove valuable in upcoming votes, whose information networks complement your own, whose daughters might make suitable wives for your sons. The menu will feature delicacies that demonstrate your host's wealth and sophistication. The conversation will touch on literature, philosophy, and art, but its real focus will be the relentless pursuit of advantage in the ongoing game of imperial politics. Before the dinner, however, you must attend to family matters that are no less political for being personal. Your eldest son, now approaching the age when he must begin his own political career, requires guidance on the alliances that will shape his future. Your daughter's marriage negotiations have reached a crucial stage, and the dowry arrangements will affect not only her happiness, but your own political standing. Even your wife, whose own aristocratic family provides both support and potential complications, must be consulted on social strategies that could influence your position in Roman high society. As you recline on silk cushions in your private study, reviewing correspondence from your agents throughout the empire, you cannot help but reflect on the precarious nature of your existence. You command wealth that rivals that of kings, live in luxury that surpasses anything most humans can imagine, wield influence over the lives of millions. Yet all of this depends ultimately on the continued favor of one man, whose moods and suspicions could transform your palace into a prison and your family into fugitives. The gladiators in their cells face a simple, brutal reality: fight well or die. Your challenges are more subtle but no less deadly. You must fight with words instead of swords, navigate treacherous political currents instead of dodging wild beasts, survive the machinations of rivals who smile while they plot your destruction. The arena where you compete is lined with marble rather than sand, but the stakes are no less final. Political death in imperial Rome can lead just as surely to literal death as any defeat in the Colosseum. Yet there are compensations that no gladiator could ever enjoy. Tonight, you will feast on delicacies gathered from across the known world. You will sleep in a bed softer than clouds, surrounded by art that represents the highest achievements of human creativity. Your children will receive educations that transform them into living libraries of human knowledge. Your name will be carved in marble monuments that will outlast the empire itself. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities for both advancement and disaster. There will be letters from provincial governors seeking your support for their policies. There will be requests from clients who need your intervention in legal disputes. There will be invitations to social events that are actually political negotiations in disguise. There will be rumors to evaluate, alliances to strengthen or abandon, investments to consider, enemies to appease or outmaneuver. But tonight, as you prepare for sleep in your magnificent bedchamber, you can take satisfaction in having survived another day in the most dangerous game ever played. You have advanced your interests without arousing fatal envy, displayed your importance without appearing threatening, navigated the countless social and political obligations that define aristocratic Roman life. Tomorrow's challenges will be met with the same careful calculation, the same mixture of courage and caution that has brought you this far. In your dreams, perhaps, you walk again through the marble halls of the Senate House, feeling the weight of ancestral dignity and contemporary power. Or perhaps you wander through the sprawling villa that represents your life's accumulation of wealth and status, counting the servants who depend on your continued success, the treasures that reflect your refined taste, the symbols of achievement that justify your place among Rome's ruling elite. But always, even in sleep, part of your mind remains alert to the dangers that surround you. For you know, as every successful Roman politician knows, that the distance between a palace and a prison can be measured in a single unwise word, a single misplaced alliance, a single moment when the deadly game of imperial politics moves faster than even the most careful player can follow. Sleep now, in silken safety, while others sleep in chains and fear. Dream of marble and gold, of power exercised and crises survived, of a world where your word shapes the destiny of nations. But remember, even in dreams, that fortunes will never stop turning, and today's victor may become tomorrow's victim in the endless struggle for survival at the heart of the greatest empire the world has ever known. And so our journey through the blood and marble of ancient Rome draws to a close, like the final rays of sunlight fading over the 7 hills, as another day ends in the eternal city. We have walked with gladiators through their daily preparation for death, followed Spartacus from slavery to rebellion to immortality, descended into the hidden engineering marvels beneath the Colosseum's sand, and dined with senators who played deadly games of politics while the empire's foundations slowly shifted beneath their feet. What connects these disparate lives? The condemned slave practicing with wooden swords, the Thracian warrior who dared to dream of freedom, the anonymous engineers who created mechanical marvels in darkness, the aristocrat whose survival depended on reading the subtlest political wines. Perhaps it is simply this: they were all human beings, struggling to find meaning and purpose within a system larger and more powerful than any individual could hope to challenge or fully understand. The gladiator in his cell, facing another dawn that might be his last, found dignity in the courage to face death without flinching. Spartacus, knowing that his rebellion would likely end in crucifixion, chose the nobility of resistance over the safety of submission. The craftsman who built the Hypogeum created beauty and ingenuity, even in service to brutality. The senator who navigated the treacherous currents of imperial politics preserved not just his own life, but the lives of the hundreds of dependents whose welfare rested on his continued success. Each found their own way to assert their humanity against a world that often seemed designed to crush individual significance. The gladiator through his skill and courage, Spartacus through his refusal to accept the definition of himself that Rome tried to impose, the engineers through their mastery of materials and mechanics, the senator through his ability to find paths between the competing demands of survival and honor. Their Rome is gone now, dissolved into the same dust that claimed their bodies. The Colosseum stands as a ruin, its underground chambers open to the sky, its lifting mechanisms long since rotted away. The gladiator skulls have been reclaimed by grass and wildflowers. The marble halls, where senators once plotted and schemed, echo now with the footsteps of tourists and the whispers of guides explaining what once was to visitors from a world the Romans could never have imagined. But something of their struggle survives, carried forward by every generation that faces its own versions of the arena, its own forms of slavery, its own imperial powers that demand submission. We find echoes of the gladiator's courage in anyone who faces overwhelming odds with dignity intact. We hear Spartacus's voice in every rebel who chooses dangerous freedom over safe servitude. We see the ingenuity of Roman engineers in every human achievement that pushes against the boundaries of the possible. We recognize the senator's careful navigation of power in everyone who tries to preserve their values while surviving in systems they cannot change. Perhaps this is why we return to their stories, why we find something both terrible and beautiful in the spectacles of ancient Rome. Not because we admire their brutality, though. We must acknowledge the dark fascination it still holds, but because we recognize something of ourselves in their struggles. They face the same fundamental questions that confront every human being. How do we find meaning in the face of mortality? How do we maintain our dignity when forces beyond our control shape our destiny? How do we balance survival with integrity, security with honor, individual desires with collective obligations? Their answers were not always admirable. Rome's treatment of its slaves was a moral catastrophe of staggering proportions. The gladiatorial games transformed suffering into entertainment in ways that should horrify any decent human conscience. The political machinations of the Senate often sacrificed justice to expediency, principle to survival. Yet within this flawed and often monstrous system, individual human beings found ways to assert their worth, to create meaning, to achieve forms of greatness that transcend the circumstances of their birth. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you carry with you the privileges that none of these ancient figures could have imagined. You sleep freely, without chains or locked doors. You face tomorrow without the prospect of violent death as entertainment for others. Your worth as a human being is not determined by your utility to masters who see you as property. Your survival does not depend on your ability to navigate the murderous intrigues of imperial politics, yet you also face challenges they would have recognized. The struggle to find purpose in systems larger than yourself. The pressure to compromise your ideals in the service of practical necessities. The constant awareness that forces beyond your control, economic, political, social, shape the boundaries within which you must construct your life. The eternal human questions about meaning, mortality, and the legacy that will leave to future generations. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you will walk once more through ancient Rome, not as a tourist viewing ruins, but as someone who understands the human reality behind the marble facades and historical abstractions. You might find yourself in the underground chambers of the Colosseum, feeling the weight of stone above you and the press of history around you. You might stand with Spartacus on that mountainside, facing the choice between certain death and possible freedom. You might sit in the Senate House, calculating the costs of every word and gesture. You might lie on a gladiator's straw pallet, listening to the distant sounds of a city that sees you as disposable entertainment. But always, you return to this moment, this place, this time when the brutal simplicities of ancient life have given way to complexities that the Romans could never have foreseen. You wake in a world where slavery is illegal, where individual rights are protected by law, where entertainment no longer requires human sacrifice. You live in an age when knowledge is freely available, when medical care can heal ailments that would have been death sentences in ancient Rome, when communication spans the globe in seconds rather than months. These advances were not inevitable. They were achieved through the accumulated choices of countless individuals who, like the figures in our stories, faced the choice between accepting the world as they found it or working to make it something better. The gladiator who chose to die with dignity rather than beg for mercy. The slave who chose rebellion over resignation. The engineer who chose to create beauty even in service to brutality. The politician who chose to preserve something of value even while compromising with power. Their individual stories ended, as all stories must, in death and the dust of centuries. But the choices they made, the stands they took, the refusal to be entirely defined by their circumstances, these things echo forward through time, becoming part of the great human conversation about what it means to live with purpose and dignity in an often indifferent universe. Rest now, in comfort they could scarcely imagine, protected by freedoms they could never have conceived. Let their voices become part of the gentle background that eases you towards sleep, not the violence and spectacle that made them famous, but the quieter courage that made them human. The gladiator's morning prayer to gods who might not listen. The rebel's dream of a homeland he might never see again. The craftsman's satisfaction in work well done, even if that work served purposes he despised. The politician's hope that tomorrow might offer chances for choices slightly more honorable than today's. Their Rome fell, as all empires fall. Their names were forgotten, as most names are forgotten. Their bodies returned to dust, as all bodies must. But something of what they were, the spark of consciousness that faced impossible circumstances and chose to remain human anyway, continues in you. In the choices you make, in the courage you show, in the refusal to let the world's brutality entirely extinguish the light of individual dignity. Sleep peacefully, citizen of a gentler age. Dream of marble and sand, if you will, of underground marvels and political intrigue, of rebellion and the price of freedom. But know that you carry forward something precious from that long-vanished world, the knowledge that human dignity can survive even the worst circumstances, that individual choices matter, even in the face of overwhelming systems, that the struggle to remain human in an inhuman world is the most important battle any of us will ever fight. The gladiators have laid down their swords, the rebels have found their rest. The engineers sleep beneath the ruins of their creations. The senators have spoken their final words, but their deepest victory, the assertion that human consciousness has worth, that no empire can destroy lives on in you. In this moment, in the simple act of choosing to be, against all odds, irrepressibly and courageously human, good night and gentle dreams.